You need to heal your hand quickly, or it will get worse. I didn't understand why my husband George took me on a fishing trip in a rowboat and let me drift away while he filmed me laughing on his phone. I thought maybe he wanted to make up after an argument. But as I drifted alone, scared and cold, I realized his true intentions. Thankfully, a man rescued me, saving my life. My name is Carol, and I'm 38 years old. I live with my husband George, who is 3 years older. We used to work together at the same company, but in different departments. We didn't interact much until George started visiting my department for no reason. Eventually, he asked me out to dinner, surprising me. We grew closer and got married 2 years ago, much to the surprise of everyone, especially my parents. They were overjoyed at our wedding. After living with my parents, George and I decided to get our own place, not too far from my parents' house. I'm home. Welcome back. Dinner is ready. Is that curry I smell? Yes, it is. Let's dig in quickly. Awesome, your curry is the best. I usually take care of the housework because I finish work on time and don't have to do overtime. Even when I lived with my parents, I enjoyed cooking and cleaning, so it's no trouble for me. But on weekends or when George gets off work early, he takes over. Our life as newlyweds was going really well without any problems. But about a year and a half into our marriage, things started to go downhill. One day, while we were eating, George sighed and said, "You're lucky, Carol, not having to work overtime." George is a manager and has been really busy lately, working extra hours. Worried about him, I said, "Well, my job is more routine, but you have so much responsibility because you're trusted, George. That's impressive." But my words seemed to upset him. "What do you mean by that? Don't praise me if you don't understand. We've had arguments before, but this was the first time I saw George so tired. Not knowing what else to say, I just said sorry, and George stormed off to his room without finishing dinner. I knew George was tired, so I didn't argue back, but I was surprised by his reaction. I heard his department was starting a new project, so I hoped things would get better once he wasn't so busy. But instead, our relationship got worse over the next few days. A week later, I had to stay late at work unexpectedly. I need to prepare some urgent documents by tomorrow, which might keep me at the office until after George gets back. Feeling a bit uneasy, I decided to text George just in case. I had to do overtime at work today. "George, if you're not working late, could you handle dinner? Or should we eat separately tonight? Sorry for any inconvenience." It had been a while since I reached out to George like this. Remembering our last argument, I added sorry to the end of the message. But all I got was a red receipt with no reply. When I got home, George was eating what looked like a meal from a convenience store, and he didn't respond when I said, "I'm home," showing he was in a bad mood. "Sorry about dinner, work kept me longer than expected." Trying to ease the tension, George interrupted me. "Do you think it's okay to work late when I come home this tired? Are you still upset about what I said earlier?" Trying to start a fight with good intentions? I was surprised by how quickly things escalated. I asked again, "So you think I'm pretending to work late just to bother you, or I'm not finishing my work because I'm lazy?" His words stung. I really have to stay late at work. This has happened before, you know. What's gotten into you? I couldn't bear George's accusatory tone any longer. I snapped back. I work hard every day too. I shouldn't have to defend myself against these accusations. But George ignored my words. I'm already stressed from work. I couldn't bear to have this tension at home, especially when I was exhausted myself. My true feelings slipped out, albeit quietly, but George noticed and didn't let it slide. "Then just quit your job," he suggested, leaving me speechless. "It's ridiculous for you, Carol, who can't even manage housework properly, to be working. After all, I'm the one paying for this apartment. You don't really need the money, do you?" His logic seemed completely off base. Feeling my frustration rise, I unintentionally raised my voice. "How can you say that? I do take care of the house, and except for the days I work late, I handle everything at home. But lately on weekends, the cleaning hasn't been up to par compared to when we first got married. Seeing dust in the corners of the floor frustrates me. I didn't know what else to do." I felt like I was about to burst into tears. "You'd have more time to focus on housework if you quit your job, and it would be easier for you too. I'll even talk to management for you," I replied. "I don't think we should be discussing this right now." I decided to pause the conversation to give it some thought. I enjoy my job and don't want to quit, but perhaps if I supported George as a full-time homemaker, we could go back to being the happy couple we used to be. It wouldn't be wise to make such a big decision hastily. Unable to bear the tension at home, I went outside. Realizing I hadn't bought dinner, I decided to bike to the supermarket near the subway station. Riding my bike in the cold night air, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. What went wrong? Suddenly, I heard a loud horn honking from behind me and bright headlights approached quickly. Instinctively, I stopped. The next thing I knew, I was lying under bright lights and a white ceiling. Opening my eyes, I saw my parents' faces in front of me, exclaiming, "She's awake." Next to them sat George, his expression unreadable. I couldn't move my arm, and my fingers felt numb. Both of my arms were wrapped in circular casts. "This means you ran a red light on your bike," the doctor explained. I remembered now. I was on my way to the supermarket when the accident happened, but I couldn't recall if the light was red or green when I crossed. The driver was shocked too, but called an ambulance for me. The gravity of what I had done hit me, and I suddenly felt even worse. But why are Mom and Dad here? George was contacted first, and then he informed them. George gave a forced smile to my parents. Understandably, after what had happened, it was awkward for me too. "I'm really glad George was there for you," my parents thanked George, who responded with a polite, "No problem," but his forced smile didn't seem sincere. I ended up spending the night in the hospital due to the lateness of the hour. However, after undergoing various tests the next morning that showed no issues, I was discharged the following day. The doctor instructed me to rest and avoid water-related chores and housework because the casts couldn't be removed. When I got home, which happened to be on my day off, I found George lounging on the sofa with a smug look. "You really messed up running that red light, but now you have no choice but to quit your job," he said without showing any concern. George lay there, staring at me mockingly. I felt powerless to respond, and to be honest, he was right. With casts on both hands, I couldn't even type properly on a computer. Faced with the decision of taking a long break or quitting altogether, I chose to resign, thinking it might improve my relationship with George. But leaving my job didn't magically fix things between us. Instead, it seemed to make him even more dissatisfied. He'd come home just to criticize me, using it as an outlet for his frustrations. During one of my worst days, George surprisingly suggested, "Why don't we go out together? It's been a while." I was suspicious of his sudden change in behavior, but George seemed to be in a good mood that day, and his overtime seemed to be decreasing. Maybe he was finally feeling less stressed. Perhaps today we could finally patch things up. Feeling more hopeful than I had in a long time, I joined George on an outing. We went to the beach, a place we used to visit together. "Here, you can fish in a rowboat," George suggested, pointing to the safe fishing area where beginners could easily fish from rowboats. This spot held special memories for me. Although I had only been here a few times, it was meaningful because George had helped me overcome my fear of the sea by teaching me how to fish. I still remembered the fun times we had here. "It's not scary, it's nostalgic," I said to George, who simply replied, "Yeah." Having a normal conversation without any snark or arguments felt incredibly refreshing and genuinely joyful after so long. After renting a boat, we successfully got on board. "Here, Carol," George said, offering his hand to help me aboard, just like old times. I carefully grasped his hand to get into the boat, being extra cautious since I couldn't use my hands to stabilize myself. Sitting down, I was reminded of our dates before we got married, which made me happy. Now we can finally get back to how we were, I thought, hoping this outing could mend our relationship. I looked at George, who then flashed a mischievous grin and kicked the boat off. "Huh!" I exclaimed, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the kick. With a sudden jolt, the boat shot out to sea, quickly drifting away from the dock where George stood. Even though I wasn't rowing, George took out his phone and filmed me, laughing and taunting, "You better heal that hand fast, or it's going to be bad." In that moment, I realized I had been tricked. I blamed myself. I had thought that if George's workload decreased and I did the housework perfectly, we could reconcile. But I was wrong. This was George's true nature. Realizing this, I felt frustrated, ashamed, and sad, and tears started flowing. Sniffling and breathing in the sea breeze, I felt the fear of being alone at sea overwhelm me. I just wanted to go home. As I sat there, eyes closed, trying to push through the fear, a man's voice startled me. "Are you okay?" You're about to drift out of the safe area, and are those casts on your arms? There was a man, likely a father, and a boy who looked a lot like him, but when our eyes met, the man exclaimed, "Oh, aren't you Carol?" with a gentle voice. I remembered him. He was Matt, George's colleague who had come to our wedding. That meant the boy next to him must be his son, Mark, who had grown a lot since our wedding. I didn't notice. What happened to you in that state? Weren't you in a bicycle accident? Matt asked, clearly confused. Yes, I was, and now I'm stuck here, unable to row. All because George put me on this boat, I explained. Matt seemed taken aback, understandably so. Being put on a boat by one's husband and left adrift at sea sounded like something out of a drama. Let's call for help, Matt said, raising his voice and calling out to the boat rental staff. Thanks to him, I was saved, while Mark played on the beach. Through tears, I told Matt everything about George, how he had treated me, and how I ended up adrift at sea today. Gradually, Matt's face grew pained, and he cried with me. It must have been hard, he said softly, offering a comforting word. I nodded, tears streaming down my face once again. Then Matt made a suggestion. I've been having my own thoughts about George recently. Would you let me handle it? After our conversation, Matt drove me home in his car. During the ride, Mark talked a lot, providing me with a genuinely enjoyable time for the first time in a while. I dreaded coming home, but it was unavoidable. With trepidation, I opened the front door to find George lounging carelessly in the living room. He smirked at me and said, "Wow, you're back. Always lucky with survival, huh?" Unable to find the energy to respond, I ignored him and went straight to my room to get ready for bed. The next morning, I didn't make breakfast for George and stayed in my room. With my hands in this condition, I couldn't cook properly anyway. But even before the boat incident, I had tried so hard to please George, even buying delicious bread. Now, all those efforts felt pointless to me. I didn't give George much thought throughout the day, and before I knew it, night had fallen. The sound of the front door opening signaled an unusually early return for George. He barged into my room and started yelling abruptly, "Hey. It was you, wasn't it?" Confused, I asked what he meant. George's voice grew louder as he accused me. "Don't play dumb with me. You're the one who told my company. What's going on?" I remained unfazed by his words, replying, "I don't know what you're talking about, but whatever trouble you're having at work doesn't involve me anymore. After all, I'm not even working there anymore." I waved off George's accusations, feeling no need to cater to him anymore. Frustrated, George stormed out of the house. The real shock came 3 days later when George, who hadn't returned home during that time, walked through the front door looking as pale as a ghost. "Carol, what should I do?" he muttered, looking lifeless as he shuffled into the room where I was relaxing. "What happened?" I asked. "I've been fired from my job," he said. "Oh, really?" I replied indifferently, watching as George collapsed to the floor. I had finally made it to manager. Despite his despair, I felt no sympathy for George because I knew this was coming. This was what Matt had hinted at when he said, "Leave it to me," during our conversation by the sea. According to Matt, George's behavior at work had taken a turn for the worse recently. He was mistreating his subordinates, dumping his work on others, falsely claiming overtime, and even harassing a new female employee, among other things. However, there was no solid proof of his actions, leaving them in a difficult situation. Despite being colleagues who were promoted to manager around the same time from different departments, Matt struggled to come to terms with George's behavior. But seeing how upset I was by George's actions, Matt felt compelled to take action. He suggested I check George's computer, suspecting it held evidence of his wrongdoing since George always took his laptop home. Matt couldn't investigate it himself. I knew George's laptop password. After safely returning from the sea, I pretended to go to sleep, waited for George to fall asleep, then checked and extracted the data from his laptop, which I then sent to Matt. I never expected things to unfold so quickly. Matt, the star of the advertising department, had acted swiftly and decisively. Standing up, I went to my drawer and retrieved something specific. Then, speaking slowly, I said, "I'm sorry to bring this up while you're feeling down, but I have something important to say." George looked at me with a puzzled expression, resembling a discarded puppy. After taking a deep breath, I continued, "I want a divorce." I finally voiced my decision, handing him the filled-out divorce papers. George's face shifted from confusion to a mix of anger and sadness as he looked at me. Why do you want divorce? Can't you show a little compassion, especially when I'm feeling so low? He pleaded. His words left me stunned, almost tempted to throw them right back at him. I'm grateful to you for revealing your true nature, and I've already discussed this with my family, I stated firmly. This wasn't just bravado. After my ordeal at sea, I had indeed gone back home and talked with my parents. That night, Matt messaged me saying, George might come crying to you in about 3 days. It's up to you, Carol, what to do next. Reflecting on my options, I decided to confide in my parents. I laid everything out for them, holding nothing back, including the terrifying experience of being adrift at sea in a boat I couldn't row. As I recounted the events, the guilt I had been suppressing and the emotions I had bottled up overwhelmed me, and I cried. My parents, who had held George in high regard, were deeply shocked by what I revealed. However, after hearing my story, they apologized for my pain and encouraged me to proceed with the divorce. Though I had been considering it, their support helped solidify my decision. When I shared my decision with George, he paled and eventually broke down, pleading, Please don't leave me. I can't bear to lose you now. Despite this desperate plea, my resolve remained firm. You should have realized before putting me on that boat, I told George. He deflated, sitting motionless on the floor. In the past, I might have comforted him, reassuring him that everything would be okay. But now I felt nothing. My love and feelings for George had long been discarded in the sea along with that fishing boat. The divorce is final. I won't be your convenience anymore, I declared firmly, my pent-up frustration fueling my words. With that, I left George behind, motionless on the floor. I grabbed a backpack with just a few belongings I had packed the night before and left the house. The night air was cool and I felt refreshingly clear-headed as I made my way back to my parents' home. Despite George's continued pleas to stay together, I proceeded with the divorce through a lawyer recommended by my father. In just a few days, George lost everything, sinking into depression and eventually returning to his parents' house, where even his mother seemed to have lost patience with him. His mother was entirely on my side, repeatedly apologizing for her son's foolishness. I didn't have much affection for George, but I had a soft spot for his mother, which made the situation unfortunate. I've heard he's now unemployed, staying at his parents' home. It's sad to see how he could be so harsh to others yet unable to handle adversity himself. After successfully ending our relationship and receiving support throughout the process, I expressed my gratitude to Matt. Once my arms healed, I returned to work and realized how much I actually enjoyed it. I used to spend each day accommodating George, but now I cherish doing what I love, immersing myself in my work and feeling fulfilled every day. I'm eager to start anew, valuing myself and navigating life with care.